Hello and welcome back to Be a Loser. So, that's my new intro. Let me know what you think in the comments. Should I keep it or go back to the previous one? So anyway, we've been discussing the macronutrients in this series and have already taken a deep dive into fat, protein, and carbohydrates. You can review those videos to refresh your memory about the goods and bads of those macros. But I decided to leave a subset of carbohydrates for their own video because they're most likely what people are concerned with whether or not they're on a low-carb diet. I'm of course talking about sugars. So as we do here, let's look at the different types of sugar and how they affect the body, as well as a look into artificial sweeteners and sugar substitutes. Now, fasten your seatbelts because this is a wild ride. Sugars make you fat. I think most people would agree with that statement. Obviously, if you don't, you can feel free to leave a comment with your reasoning. And of course, please leave your sugar industry credentials. So yes, most people agree that sugar is fattening. But why it's fattening is generally less clear. Some people consider sugars as empty calories. Some think that sugar makes food taste better and thus cause us to overeat these sweetened foods. Some believe that sugar may stimulate reward sensors in the brain and thus cause overeating and obesity. Sugar is also a carbohydrate, which may be the reason that it's fattening. And others believe that it's just pure metabolic poison. But let's be clear, no carbs, even sugars, are actually poisonous. It's just an analogy used to describe their metabolic effects. Now, while all of the previous reasons why sugars may be fattening are plausible, a closer look is required because not all sugars affect weight gain in the same amount or the same way. So first, let's define the different types of sugars. The first is a 6-ring sugar found in the blood known as glucose. Nearly every cell in the body can use glucose. Many tissues and organs have glucose receptors and it circulates through the body with very few limitations. It's the preferred fuel for the brain. It can quickly energize the muscles, especially in great times of stress. Glucose is stored in the body in many forms, such as glycogen in the liver. So then there is a 5-ring sugar known as fructose. This sugar occurs naturally in fruit. Fructose cannot be used directly by the body in its natural form. So that means the brain can't use it for fuel. The muscles can't use it for energy. It has to be metabolized in the liver first. Thus, fructose has little to no effect on blood sugar levels. Well, that sounds good, right? Well, we'll see. So finally, there's sucrose. This is a combination of one glucose molecule and one fructose molecule bonded together. Sucrose is better known as table sugar. I think most people are familiar with this form of sugar. Now, as we know from the carbohydrate video, carbs are typically classified as either simple or complex based on their chain length. Simple carbohydrates are shorter chains of only 1 or 2 linked sugars, while complex carbs have longer chains. The problem here is that this boils down a carb to just the chain length and that's it. The logic behind this was that longer chains should take longer to digest, but this simply isn't the case. If you look at the glycemic index, which is fraught with its own problems, one can see that white bread, a complex carb, has a much higher GI score than glucose, a simple carb. So a better way of differentiating is obviously necessary. The real issue with sucrose and fructose is in the amount ingested. In 1977, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans warned about the dangers of too much sugar. However, the anti-fat crusade followed this, and since fat was the main concern, the sugar content of foods was ignored or forgotten. Consumption of sugar increased sharply beginning in '77 as people became more and more concerned about the fat contents of their food. Even today, you can buy a bag of candy like gummy bears that will proudly proclaim that it's fat-free. Sure, no fat in there because it's all sugar. And fat isn't as bad as it was made out to be. Some of it anyway. And while candy is bad for you, we typically only eat it occasionally. It's generally not a mainstay of most people's diets. So the big culprit in the obesity epidemic was sugar-sweetened drinks, sodas, juices, and teas. By the year 2000, these sugar-sweetened drinks provided 22% of the sugar found in the American diet, compared to 16% in 1970. No other food group even comes close. However, by the year 2000, people started to recognize the villainy of sugar. Led in no small part by Dr. Atkins and his diet revolution, people started to realize that sugar really was a player in the obesity epidemic. Sugar-sweetened sodas started to decline in popularity. Sweetened teas and sports drinks tried to take their place, but haven't really caught on. Soda is a $75 billion industry that has until recently seen nothing but good times. In the 70s, people doubled their intake of soda. By the 80s, it was more popular than tap water. By 1998, Americans were drinking 56 gallons per year. Hell, I grew up drinking big gulps. Remember those things? And though there is great opposition to these sugary sodas, from extra taxation to straight up political attempts to outlaw them, the soda industry continues to tell us to drink them. And in general, succeeds through very clever marketing. Take, for example, the original small size of McDonald's fountain drink of 7 ounces. And compare that to the current kid size of 12 ounces. Genius. So if you work for the sugar industry and your job is to sell sugar, how do you do it in a country that has now become so focused on how bad sugars are for you? I mean, seriously, since 2000, we've had the low-calorie supporters, the low-carbers, the paleo proponents, and the raw foodies all touting the ills of sugar. And the answer is, you sell your sugar in other countries. And who do you target? The third world. The areas of the world that historically consumed the least sugar, especially Asia and Africa. Yep. As consumption of sugar stabilized or fell in most areas of the world, it began to rise in Asia and Africa. And what was the result? A diabetes epidemic. A report published in the Journal of American Medical Association in September 2013 estimates that 11.6% of adults in China have type 2 diabetes. This beats the longtime champion, the USA, at 11.3%. 22 million new diabetes cases were added since 2007. FYI, that number is approximately the population of Australia. And if you add in the statistic that only 1% of Chinese people had type 2 diabetes in 1980, then this is a 1,160% rise in T2D levels within a single generation. And all this despite the fact that the Chinese had an average body mass index of 23.7, which is considered normal weight, versus the average in the US of 28.7, which is overweight. So how does that work? I mean, even if China had doubled its sugar consumption since '06, it wouldn't reach levels seen in North America. And the answer lies in its relatively high consumption of other carbohydrates. Now, sugar-sweetened drinks bear much of the blame here. Juice has been connected to childhood obesity for a long time. Studies show a close correlation between the intake of juice and childhood obesity. However, whole fruit bears no relationship to obesity due to the protective nature of the fiber content. And the same holds true for adults and their consumption of the sugar-sweetened drinks. If you go from drinking few of these drinks to drinking more, weight gain nearly doubles. And conversely, if you go from drinking them a lot to drinking nearly none, then weight gain goes to nearly zero. And of course, the risk of diabetes goes up with higher consumption of these sugary drinks. Now, this is a moment where we pause and let the calorie counters get in their argument. It's total calories that are making them fat and diabetic, not the sugar specifically. And okay, sugar is an empty calorie, meaning no real food value or micronutrients. So sure, let's take a look at that. That seems plausible. Well, sugar causes obesity as well as diabetes. Those two are related. So a study looked at sugar's specific role in T2D. And the result? For every extra 150 kilocalories per person per day of sugar, the prevalence of diabetes rose by 1.1%. No other food group showed any significant relationship with diabetes. Diabetes correlates to sugar, not calories. Man, do I want to scream that. But of course, it makes sense, right? Watch my T2D series, and the prevailing message there is that this is a disease of too much storage of sugar within the body. Not blood sugar, but all sugar. Sugar is a highly refined carbohydrate, just like white flour and white rice and potatoes. But the effect of sugar on diabetes and obesity is significantly higher than either of the others. But why? Well, it turns out that sugar is, in fact, bad in many different ways, not just as a refined carbohydrate. After all, we know that the Asian diet up to the 1990s was extremely high in carbohydrate, but very low in sugar, and obesity and diabetes was extremely rare. Turns out that the main toxicity in sugar lies in the fructose. Previously, sucrose intake was not considered bad for diabetics. In fact, an article in the New York Times in 1983 stated that diabetics may eat foods containing ordinary sugar if they keep the amount of calories at the same constant level. The FDA's review in 1986 stated that other than the contribution to dental caries, there's no exclusive evidence on sugars that demonstrates a hazard. Yeah, they were only worried about cavities. There didn't seem to be much concern that eating more sugar would raise blood sugar. Until recently, the American Diabetes Association's own website stated that experts agree that you can substitute small amounts of sugar for other carbohydrate-containing foods into your meal plan. What the f***? The issue there was that, as we discussed, sugar has a lower glycemic index than other refined carbohydrates. Since experts were focusing on only the refined aspect of sugar, well, then this made sense, right? Replace a high GI food with a low GI food. Seems logical. Wrong, but logical. Sucrose, as I said, is composed of equal parts of glucose and fructose. The glucose portion will raise blood sugars and thus raise insulin levels. The fructose portion will not. Fructose doesn't raise blood sugars. Therefore, it has an extremely low glycemic index. Additionally, fructose produces a very small insulin response compared to glucose. So for many years, this led many people to view fructose as a healthy form of sweetener. And lots of people jumped on this bandwagon because you know what? Fructose is the main sugar in fruit. Well, geez, that's a no-brainer, right? A sugar that occurs naturally in fruit and has no effect on blood and glucose levels?
High five.
The problem is in consumption, specifically in the amount of consumption. Natural fruit consumption contributed only small amounts to the diet, but added sweeteners, particularly in the form of sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, HFCS, added large amounts. HFCS was developed in the 1960s as a liquid sugar equivalent to sucrose. It contains 55% fructose and 45% glucose, compared to the 50-50 split seen in sucrose. Sucrose was processed from sugar cane and sugar beets. While this isn't exactly expensive, it wasn't exactly cheap either. HFCS, however, could be processed from corn, something of which the US has lots. Another thing HFCS had going for it was that it was liquid and therefore easily incorporated into any food. And boy, was it. Pizza sauce, soups, breads, cookies, cakes, ketchup, yada, yada, yada. But the advantages didn't stop there. It's sweeter than glucose. It prevents freezer burn. It helps browning. It mixes easily. It extends shelf life, and it keeps bread soft. But the main benefit to HFCS compared to sucrose was that it was cheap. However, the beginning of the end began in 2004 when a study was published showing that the increase in obesity mirrored the rise in the use of HFCS. However, at the same time, there was a significant decrease in the use of sucrose, which was more expensive. HFCS was merely replacing the more expensive refined sugar in the American diet. The rise in obesity actually mirrored the increase in the use of all sugar. Whether it's HFCS or sucrose, the problem is the fructose. But the benefit of this was that fructose went under much greater scrutiny to determine the dangers posed by excess fructose consumption. Researchers started to investigate the differences between glucose and fructose. And as it turns out, there are many differences. Glucose can be used by every cell in the body. In fact, some cells, such as red blood cells, can only use glucose. No cell in the body has the ability to use fructose for energy. While free fructose is poorly absorbed, in the presence of glucose, the amount of fructose absorbed will significantly increase. Glucose requires insulin in order to be fully absorbed, but fructose does not. Fructose can only be metabolized in the liver. What this means is that while glucose can be dispersed throughout the body for use as energy, fructose becomes concentrated in the liver. When an excess of glucose is consumed, the body naturally limits it to prevent overloading the metabolic system. There isn't a system in place for this with fructose. The more you eat, the more you metabolize into glucose, lactate, and glycogen. As the levels of fructose ingestion go higher, the fructose becomes acetyl-CoA, which is needed for fatty acid synthesis. What this means is that excess fructose becomes fat in the liver. High levels of fructose will cause fatty liver. Yes, the glucose part of both sugars will make you gain weight, but the fructose is far worse. Think of it this way. If the average person is 180 pounds, the glucose they ingest from either sucrose or HFCS is metabolized by all 180 pounds of tissue. However, the fructose part of those same sugars can only be metabolized by the 5 pounds of tissue in the liver. This makes fructose something like 20 times more likely to cause fatty liver. Fatty liver leads to insulin resistance. Therefore, fructose causes insulin resistance. For more on that, you can rewatch my insulin resistance video, but the main takeaway is that IR leads to weight gain, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. Okay, so that's a pretty bold statement, so let's look at some studies to corroborate it. There were studies linking the use of fructose, but not glucose, to the development of insulin resistance in humans as far back as 1980. One such study examined the effect of adding 1,000 kilocalories per day of excess calories as glucose versus fructose in healthy young people. Body weight over the duration of the test did not change in either group. Intravenous insulin was injected into the subjects after the overfeeding period, and blood glucose was measured. The group with excessive glucose intake did not show any statistical difference in sensitivity to insulin. The fructose group, however, showed a 25% decrease in their insulin sensitivity after 1 week. And for the calorie counters, let's remember that both groups had been overfed by the same amount of calories. Another recent study showed a similar effect. Normal, healthy subjects were overfed fructose. De novo lipogenesis, which is the production of new fat in the liver, increased 6-fold, accompanied by a 79% increase in plasma triglycerides. A measure of insulin resistance in the liver showed an increase to IR of 28%. And that was after 6 days. These previously healthy subjects were well on their way to being diabetics after 6 days of overconsumption of fructose. And yet, another study had horrifying results. In this study, healthy subjects were given 25% of their daily calories as Kool-Aid, sweetened with either glucose or fructose for 8 weeks. Sounds like a lot of calories from sugar daily, but in reality, many people consume daily amounts similar to this. After oral glucose tolerance tests, the fructose group, but not the glucose group, had already developed prediabetes. This was due to the finding that the fructose group had developed significantly more insulin resistance than the glucose group. Insulin levels were also significantly higher in the fructose group. And I'll say it again for the calorie shippers. Both groups were given equal caloric amounts of fructose or glucose. The fructose group also had much less effect on their blood glucose since fructose has a very low GI. Remember me telling you the GI had some problems? Well, there's a pretty big one. Now, the reason that this is so horrifying is that while the amount of fructose consumed was admittedly high, it was only for 8 weeks. What's going to happen to you after years or decades of overconsumption? Fructose will lead to fatty liver, insulin resistance, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. So now it should become clear why sugar is so fattening. We can put the pieces together. Sucrose is half glucose and half fructose. HFCS is 55% fructose and 45% glucose. In both cases, the glucose as a refined carb acts to stimulate insulin. At the same time, the fructose is stimulating insulin resistance in the liver. These two work together to rapidly cause weight gain and obesity. Glucose raises insulin. Fructose increases insulin resistance, which leads to more insulin production, which leads to more insulin resistance. Sugars aren't just empty calories. They aren't just refined carbs. Sugars are far more sinister than that. Obviously, if you want to avoid gaining weight and becoming obese and even diabetic, the first place to start is to cut out sugar from your diet. And as we've discussed previously in the video, the biggest source of sugar in most people's diet comes in the form of beverages. So cutting out sugary drinks is a good start. This would include sodas, sweetened tea, and fruit juices. Fruit juices. So what about whole fruit? Whole fruit typically makes up about 18% of an individual's dietary intake. And as we know, fructose is naturally occurring in fruit. So should we reduce our fruits in our diet? And the answer is maybe. Biochemically, there's no difference between fructose in fruit and fructose in sugar. And there's no studied link between whole fruit consumption and obesity or T2D. So I'll quote Dr. Jason Fung here. If whole fruit is the worst that you do in your diet, that's okay. However, if you need to reduce weight, then consider reducing fruit. I also have another video on this subject if you want a little more clarity. So let's talk about those sugar substitutes and artificial sweeteners. Replacing a regular sugared drink with diet sodas seems like a good way to lose weight. Diet drinks have 0 calories and no sugar. Since this will lower sugar intake, it seems like a good idea. Both the American Diabetes Association and the American Heart Association in 2012 endorsed the use of diet drinks as a way of losing weight and improving health. But if diet drinks substantially improved obesity or diabetes, then we'd expect to see the incidence of obesity and diabetes level off or go down as we increase consumption of diet drinks. From 1960 to 2000, there has been a 400% increase in the use of diet drinks. However, the obesity and diabetes epidemic rages on. So we must conclude that diet drinks aren't really helping. And in fact, it actually goes beyond that. There's evidence that diet drinks are actually harmful. In a study that followed 5,158 adults, the risk of becoming overweight in the 7 to 8 years of follow-up was increased by 47% through the use of artificially sweetened drinks. And beyond weight gain, there's a danger as well. One study saw a 43% increase in the risk of strokes and heart attacks in people drinking diet sodas. So here we have a conundrum. We're reducing sugar by drinking diet soda. Isn't that a good thing? Well, no. We're replacing sugar with something artificial. Artificial sweeteners like aspartame and sucralose are synthesized in a lab and then sold in food because they happen to be sweet. They aren't food. There's nothing food-like about them. And they don't even help you lose weight. In a recent study, 224 overweight adolescents were divided into 2 random groups. One group was given a year's worth of water and diet drinks to consume. At the end of 2 years, it was clear that the diet soda group was consuming less sugar than the regular group. However, if you look at the weight gain, there's no significant difference between the 2 groups. In another study, a group of 641 normal weight children were randomly assigned to continue drinking as previously or switch to drinking diet sodas. Now in this study, there was a statistical difference between the 2 groups, but not as much of one as we'd hope. The diet soda group weighed about 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds less at the end of 18 months. So yes, drinking diet soda will reduce sugar intake, but no, it won't help your weight loss much. So ideally we want to reduce sugar and not replace it with completely artificial substances. I mean, if you follow my LCHF series, you would know that that is completely counter to everything that I discuss in there. Eat whole, natural food. Be healthy, lose weight. And to close this video on sugar, I leave you with a quote from Prevalence, considered to be the founder of modern toxicology. The dose makes the poison. Anything, even if typically considered beneficial, can be harmful in excessive amounts. Oxygen can be toxic at high levels. Water can be toxic at high levels. And fructose is no different. Now, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. And of course, if you like the video, please click the thumbs up as it helps me gain more exposure. And I'd love if you would share the video with anyone whom you think could benefit from the information. And of course, keep those comments and questions coming. Well, we hit 5,000 subscribers less than a month ago, and we have blown up since then. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your support. And a special thanks to all my patrons and those who have donated through PayPal. You can always find links to support the channel in the video description. As always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, keep being a loser.